There is a city that was larger than any city in Europe when the Spanish first saw it. Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of a lake in the Valley of Mexico, surrounded by causeways and aqueducts and floating gardens, housing somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people at its height, was by almost any measure the most impressive urban achievement in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish soldiers who entered it in 1519 under Hernán Cortés wrote letters home, describing a city of impossible grandeur, of marketplaces where more goods changed hands in a single day than in any market in Spain, of temples that rose above the rooftops like mountains, of a social order so complex and so efficiently organized that the most educated men among the conquistadors confessed they had no adequate frame of reference for what they were seeing. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who participated in the conquest and wrote about it decades later from memory, described the first sight of Tenochtitlan from the causeway as something that seemed like the enchantments described in the Book of Amadis, the chivalric romance that Spanish soldiers of his generation had grown up reading. He meant it as the highest possible compliment. He meant that what he was seeing seemed too extraordinary to be real. It was real. The floating gardens, the chinampas, produced agricultural yields that fed a city larger than London or Paris, or any other European capital of the time. The aqueducts carried fresh water from the mainland springs to an island city surrounded by brackish lake water. The administrative system organized the tribute from hundreds of subject communities into a flow of goods that supplied the capital with everything it needed, and the surplus that supported its artisan class and its military. And then within 2 years it was gone. The city was destroyed in the siege of 1521 after Cortés built a fleet of boats on the lake shore and used them to cut the causeways and blockade the city until thirst and starvation broke the resistance that his armies could not break by direct assault. The lake was drained over the following centuries. The temples were demolished and their stones used to build the cathedral and the colonial buildings that surround it, standing in the center of what is now Mexico City, directly over the ruins of the Aztec sacred precinct. What the Spanish did to Tenochtitlan was not simply military conquest. It was obliteration, deliberate, systematic, and thorough enough that for generations the full scale of what had existed was recoverable only from the letters of the soldiers who had seen it, and the accounts of the indigenous people who had survived. And then the genetics arrived. The Aztec civilization, which the people themselves called the Mexico, was at the time of Spanish contact the dominant power in a tribute empire that controlled most of central Mexico and extracted wealth from communities from the Gulf Coast to the Pacific. The empire was not ancient. The Mexica had arrived in the Valley of Mexico as a relatively minor nomadic group sometime in the 12th or 13th century, spending generations as subordinates and mercenaries for more established city-states before establishing Tenochtitlan in 1325. Within 200 years they had built an empire. This extraordinary speed of ascent, from wandering outsiders to imperial rulers in less than 2 centuries, is one of the defining features of Aztec history, and it has a genetic dimension that the ancient DNA research is only beginning to reveal. When researchers began analyzing ancient DNA from central Mexican archaeological sites in the 2010s and 2020s, the first challenge they encountered was the familiar one of tropical preservation. Central Mexico is warm and humid, conditions hostile to the long-term survival of organic material including bone and the genetic sequences within it. The ancient DNA database for Mesoamerica has grown more slowly than the databases for Europe, Siberia, and the Americas further north, and the data that has been recovered is more fragmentary and more difficult to interpret with confidence. But enough has been recovered to begin asking specific questions about the people who built one of the most dramatic civilizations in the pre-Columbian world. The genetic profiles of ancient individuals from central Mexican sites spanning the pre-Aztec and Aztec periods show the deep ancestry that characterizes all Native American populations. the founding migration signature that traces back through the Americas to the Beringian crossing at the end of the Pleistocene. This is expected. What is more specific and more historically interesting is what the DNA shows about the population movements within Mesoamerica in the centuries before Spanish contact. The Mexico oral tradition itself described a long migration from a mythological origin place called Aztlan, a journey that brought them southward through multiple generations to the Valley of Mexico. The DNA from pre-Aztec sites in the regions the Mexica passed through shows a complex population history in central Mexico, with evidence of multiple distinct ancestry streams contributing to the mosaic of city-states and ethnic groups that characterized the region before Aztec dominance. The Mexica who eventually built Tenochtitlan were genetically the product of this complex regional history, a population that had absorbed and been absorbed by multiple other Mesoamerican groups across their centuries of migration and settlement. But the genetic story of the Aztecs is not primarily a story about their origins. It is primarily a story about what happened to them after 1519 and what the scale of what happened left in the genetic record of the people who came after. The population of central Mexico at the time of Spanish contact is estimated at somewhere between 15 and 25 million people. The uncertainty in that number reflecting the difficulty of reconstructing pre-contact demographics from post-contact sources. Within a century of the conquest, that population had declined to somewhere between 1 and 2 million. This was not primarily a military casualty. The Spanish armies were devastating, but they could not have killed 15 million people with 16th century weapons. The killing was done by disease. Smallpox arrived in Mexico in 1520, a year before the fall of Tenochtitlan, carried by a member of a Spanish expedition. It swept through a population that had no prior exposure and therefore no immune resistance, killing somewhere between 1.25% of the people it reached in the first epidemic alone. And then came the second epidemic, and the third, and the fourth. Researchers studying the epidemiology of the Mexican colonial period have identified at least 16 major epidemic events in the century following Spanish contact, each one moving through a population that had been weakened by the previous one. The most catastrophic was the cocoliztli epidemic of 1545 to 1550. Which recent ancient DNA research has identified as likely caused by Salmonella enterica paratifici, a cause of enteric fever, possibly facilitated by a severe drought that contaminated water sources across the region. The cocoliztli alone may have killed between 5 and 15 million people. The genetic record of this catastrophe is written in the DNA of modern Mexican populations in the same way that the Irish famine is written in the DNA of Irish Americans. Studies comparing ancient central Mexican DNA from before and after the conquest period show a dramatic reduction in genetic diversity that reflects the population bottleneck of the demographic collapse. The modern Mexican population carries a genetic profile shaped by that bottleneck, by the subsequent centuries of intermarriage between indigenous survivors and Spanish colonists and the enslaved African people the Spanish brought to the Americas, and by the specific geographic and social patterns of who survived and who was most severely affected by the epidemic sequence. The cocoliztli research is one of the most direct applications of ancient DNA to a specific historical event in the entire field. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, working with ancient teeth from a colonial-era mass grave at the site of Tepozcalula Yucunda in Oaxaca, extracted bacterial DNA alongside human DNA from the burials and identified the Salmonella pathogen in samples associated with the cocoliztli epidemic period. This was not simply confirming that people had died of disease. It was reading the specific pathogen that killed them from DNA extracted from 500-year-old teeth, a level of forensic precision that would have been impossible a decade earlier. The people buried at Tepozcalula Yucunda were not Aztec. They were Mixtec, a different Mesoamerican culture. But the same epidemic that killed them swept through the entire region, and the genetic evidence of its passage is present in ancient remains from multiple sites across the colonial period. The genetics of the Aztec story are also, increasingly, the genetics of Mexico itself. Modern Mexicans carry in their genomes a complex mixture of indigenous Mesoamerican ancestry, Spanish ancestry, and African ancestry in proportions that vary enormously by region and by social history. The indigenous component of that mixture, which is most concentrated in the rural communities of southern and central Mexico, and most diluted in the urban populations of the north, carries the genetic legacy of the pre-contact civilizations, including the Aztec, as attenuated and blended threads in a population shaped by 5 centuries of colonial mixing. The ancient DNA work is making it possible, for the first time, to read those threads separately from the colonial contributions and to ask specific questions about which pre-contact populations contributed most significantly to which modern communities. The answers are beginning to emerge. They show a Mexico whose indigenous genetic heritage is more regionally specific and more historically structured than the simple category of Mexican indigenous ancestry suggests. A mosaic of genetic contributions from the Aztec, and the Maya and the Mixtec and the Zapotec and dozens of other pre-contact civilizations, each one contributing its specific thread to the fabric of the population that survived the conquest and continued. Tenochtitlan is gone. The lake it was built on is gone. The empire is gone. The temples were pulled down stone by stone, and the stones were repurposed. The sacred precinct where the Aztec performed their ceremonies was buried under the foundations of the metropolitan cathedral, which took 2 centuries to build on top of what the Aztec had built in 200 years. The Spanish could tell the story of the conquest in ways that served the colonial order. They could burn the codices and replace the priestly knowledge with Christian catechism and reorganize the population into colonial municipalities that erased the boundaries of the pre-contact political world. They could do all of that and more, and they did. What they could not do was reach the DNA. The genetic legacy of the people who built Tenochtitlan is present in the DNA of millions of contemporary Mexicans who carry it without necessarily knowing its specific history or what civilization it came from. The bottleneck of the demographic collapse is visible in the reduced diversity of modern Central Mexican indigenous DNA, compared to what the ancient samples suggest was present before the conquest. The specific ancestry components of pre-contact Mesoamerican populations are traceable in the modern Mexican genetic profile as threads woven into a fabric that 5 centuries of colonial mixing has complicated but not erased. The ancient DNA work is making it possible for the first time to begin separating those threads, to ask which pre-contact people contributed most to which modern communities. To recover the genetic dimension of a history that the colonial record told only from one side, the answers are emerging slowly, imperfectly, with the honest uncertainty that good science always carries. And what they show, without exception, is that the people who built the largest city in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere were not erased by the conquest. They were transformed by it. Their descendants are alive. Their DNA is in the ground and in the living, waiting to be read, carrying forward the record of everything the conquest tried to make permanently unknowable.